Good afternoon and good morning to everyone who's tuned in from Western Australia. My name's Tony Shannon. I'm a business advisor with the Entrepreneurs Program, which is managed by AusIndustry, part of the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. This is the second of our 5 webinars on cybersecurity, which will be presented by Aaron and Nick from Hyvint, who gave us some excellent tips on cybersecurity a few weeks ago. And if you missed that video, that webinar, you can find the video probably via the business.gov.au website. And this webinar today will be available in the same spot quite quickly after today's webinar has finished. Today, Aaron and Nick will be talking to us about cybersecurity threats. So this is the part where we really start to sit up and take notice. As usual, we'll be looking for questions. There should be an icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen where you can click on that and submit your questions, and we will address those at the end. So please feel free to submit them during the webinar so that you don't forget what you wanted to know about. And there's a possibility that the questions we don't get to today will be addressed via the Hyvint website, where they have a special knowledge system that you can log into and access all their information and knowledge. Anyway, that's enough from me. Here it is, the second webinar on cybersecurity from the Entrepreneurs Program and Hyvint. Thank you.
Welcome to the second instalment in this webinar series focusing on cybersecurity for small and medium businesses. These webinars are run by Hyvint, Australia's fastest growing cybersecurity consulting firm, as part of the Australian Government's Business Entrepreneurs Program, and they'll help you to understand the key cybersecurity issues facing small and medium businesses. The webinars will also provide you with some simple strategies you can implement to greatly improve your business's overall level of security. In today's webinar, we will look at some of the key cybersecurity threats facing small and medium-sized businesses like yours, as well as the specific steps you can take to improve your ability to counter those threats. Before we do that, let's briefly recap what we covered in our last webinar. In webinar 1, we explained that small and medium businesses are an increasingly attractive target for cyber attackers. This is because attackers perceive that businesses of this size are easier to compromise due to a lack of cybersecurity preparedness. So, it's important that you make cybersecurity a priority for your own organisation. We also discussed the importance of understanding that cybersecurity is an ongoing journey that continues for as long as your business operates, because cyber attackers never cease in their efforts to compromise your business's security. And the good news is, there are some simple steps you can take wherever you are on that journey to improve your security. We covered these briefly, and we'll go into detail about these in webinar 3. But just to remind you, if you're just starting out on the cybersecurity journey, remember to keep your hardware and software up to date with the latest patches, enabling auto-update features whenever possible. Move your corporate email accounts to a cloud-based email service with inbuilt filtering to help combat malicious emails. Use strong and unique passwords for each of your accounts, and back up your important business data to a separate location. If you're further along on the cybersecurity journey, then you can encrypt your key data and devices. Look to implement proper user account management, including making sure you limit access to administrative accounts and only provide each of your employees with the access they need to do their job. Educate your employees on key cybersecurity issues. Put in place a specialist email filtering solution, and consider acquiring cyber insurance. There's also the option of looking to industry-recognised standards as a way of continuing to improve your security once you've taken all these steps. Remember, at any time, you can sign up for free to access Hyvint's Security Colony collaboration platform at portal.securitycolony.com/register, and you'll be able to ask any further questions you may have after a webinar concludes and access summaries of what was covered. You'll also be able to access additional resources to help you on your cybersecurity journey. Once again, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Please enjoy today's webinar.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome again to this second webinar that Hyvint's running in conjunction with the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science Business Entrepreneurs Program. in relation to cybersecurity for your small or medium business. My name's Aaron Ragu.
And I'm Nick Elsmore, also from Hyvant. Welcome.
In today's webinar, we're going to be looking at the specific cybersecurity threats that your small or medium business is most likely to face in today's online threat landscape. You'll recall in webinar 1, we spoke about some of these threats, or really spoke about all of these threats, but in the context of a broader discussion about cybersecurity being an ongoing journey for your business. In today's webinar, we're actually going to drill down in some more detail into the specific cybersecurity threats you're likely to face, look at some specific case studies where applicable about how some of these threats have unfolded in the past based on our own experience, and we're really going to examine the specific steps you can take to minimize your susceptibility to fall prey to any of these types of threats. You'll notice there's a clear overlap between some of the advice we provided in webinar 1, but the difference today is that we're going to be shifting the perspective somewhat in the sense that we're going to be looking at each specific type of cybersecurity threat and then looking at the specific steps you can take in relation to each type of threat to mitigate your susceptibility to that type of threat. You'll also notice that there's a fair degree of overlap between the type of steps we're going to talk about today. So for example, for a number of the threats we discuss, we're going to be referring to the importance of implementing a regular and robust patching process across your key systems, your key operating systems, your key software, and your key hardware. And that's going to be, that's an intentional message because the ultimate takeaway that we want to give from today's webinar is that ultimately it's important to realize that while the cybersecurity threat landscape may at first seem vast and may seem daunting, by taking a few simple steps wherever you are on your cybersecurity journey, you can greatly improve your organization's overall ability to stay secure in the face of this range of threats. Now, in terms of the broad range of threats we're going to discuss today, they fall into 5 broad categories, and I'll briefly go through those now. The first category are malicious email scams, and these include the ever-present phishing scams, which no doubt many of you, or all of you probably have encountered in your personal or professional lives in some context. And effectively this is when cyber attackers will send you an email message attempting to coax you into clicking on a bogus link that takes you to a fake website that attempts to masquerade as some reputable organization, and they'll look to get you to disclose sensitive information such as account details, which they can then use to access and, for example, commit fraudulent transactions against your consent. We'll also be looking at business email compromise scams, and these are very much a growing type or a derivation of phishing scams that are heavily customized and targeted. And the payoff for cyber attackers can be quite significant with these types of scams, so they're worth spending some time discussing. We'll also be looking at ransomware. Now, ransomware has particularly grown in prominence in the last 12 months in particular, with global ransomware attacks such as the Petya ransomware attack and the WannaCry ransomware scam, and effectively this refers to situations where cyber attackers infect key systems in your organization with malicious software that encrypts your key files, and unless you pay a specified ransom within a certain period of time, you're no longer able to access that information. Thirdly, we'll be looking at hacking and device compromise. And this is a broad label that refers to a range of ways in which cyber attackers may look to compromise the security of your internet-facing infrastructure or your internal IT infrastructure. Fourthly, we'll look at a range of, basically we've used the label insider and other threats. This is effectively a label that describes a range of different actors such as hacktivists, cyber espionage groups, and malicious insiders that might look to compromise your organization's security for a variety of reasons. And lastly, we'll look at denial of service attacks. Denial of service attacks have been around for some years now, particularly grew in prominence in the public eye in 2016 when the Australian census experienced a denial of service attack where cyber attackers effectively flooded the website with illegitimate traffic, which meant that legitimate users of the website were not able to provide their census data on time.
And I think on that, the element that's really worth considering, I guess, when looking at those different types of attacks, and when we're talking about the insider and other attacks, a lot of the attacks that we're talking about here are financially motivated, but not all of them. There are some cases if you're actually being targeted by, for example, an international government, which may sound ridiculous, but we'll talk about some cases where it is actually realistic. And also if you're being targeted by insiders or hacktivists, having an understanding of who might have an interest in targeting your organisation and what they're after will really allow you to get a better perspective on the types of attacks and the types of threats that are going to be relevant for your organisation. So starting with malicious email scams, a survey was recently done by the New South Wales Small Business Commissioner looking at email attacks and looking at online security for small and medium businesses, and the research is available online and it's really worth having a look at. One of the interesting findings that they found was that most of the small and medium businesses that were surveyed felt that their business was largely protected from cyber attacks based on the fact that they had a very limited online presence. So they didn't do a lot of transactions online, they didn't necessarily have an online storefront, and so they felt that they didn't have a very significant exposure. And while at some level that's certainly the case, the more you do, the more of an internet footprint that you have, the bigger your attack surface. The reality is that the most frequent online activity that people reported was email, and by far the most frequent and the largest attack vector that exists at the moment in cybercrime is email. And so even if that's the only thing that your organisation does online, it's still worthwhile understanding some of the threats that can come through that means. Now in 2017, one of the statistics we saw suggested around 270 billion emails are sent every day. When you consider there are only 8 billion odd people on the planet and a lot of us still don't have access to any internet whatsoever, the number that is actually being generated on a per person on the internet basis is pretty staggering. And the reality is that the majority of that is not genuine traffic. The majority of that is either spam or malicious email traffic. And what that means is that even if the only thing that you are doing online is email, you're still getting exposed to quite a significant risk exposure. Now, when we're looking at email scams, we can break that into two broad groups, the first being phishing and the second being business email compromise, as Aaron mentioned earlier. And phishing itself then splits into a few different groups. I'm sure most people have received what are known as the 419 scams. Now these are the scams that come saying that a Nigerian prince has died and has left someone $50 million access, and if you respond, you might be able to get access to some of that money. Those have been around for as long as time has existed. They've been sent through email, they've been done in person. There are any number of ways. They're just really traditional scams that have now migrated to an email environment. There's then the next evolution of those, which is the phishing email purporting to come from a bank or some other organization trying to get you to click on a link and then hand over your credentials. And if you hand over your credentials, your user ID and password, the attacker will then log in and conduct some sort of fraudulent transaction using those credentials. And then the next two variants are basically trying to compromise a system. So it's either trying to get you to click on a link, and then the website that you visit will infect your system with some kind of malware or ransomware, or they're trying to get you to click on a file, whether it's a PDF file, a Word document, a zip file, or an executable file, and again, it's trying to infect your system with some kind of malware or ransomware. So those are the four broad groups of phishing, and we'll talk about how you can defend against some of those in a moment. And the other type around business email compromise, as Aaron mentioned, is a much more targeted attempt to try and get you to conduct a financial transaction. So in business email compromise scams, they're not trying to get information from you. They're generally not trying to actually compromise your system. They're trying to get you in your business process, your standard payment process, they're trying to get you to transfer money directly to the attacker. Now when we're looking at email scams, most people would have received these. Just an email scam that comes pretending to be from your bank. Often they come through email. These days they can also come through social media, through Facebook messaging, through LinkedIn, and even through other things like SMS. They're designed to look convincing, and they're designed to get you to click on a link and to do something at the website that you ultimately end up visiting. Now, this page here is actually a slide that was put together for a client, and they actually used it as a sticker. So they actually printed this out as a sticker, and they had it stuck on pretty much every desk of every staff member in the organization. And it was 7 key tips to catch a phishing message, to try and spot a phishing message and tell the difference between a real message and a fake message. If you visit our Security Colony website, this is available. It's a free download. You can download it, print it, stick it up, and it's a useful reference for when you do get a message and you're not quite sure about whether or not it's legit. Some of the key points here, you'll often see that the messages come from a from address. The email address that it's from doesn't look quite right. In the example on the screen here, instead of being ato.gov.au, it's coming from atogov.com, which at first glance might seem legitimate, but if you look at it a bit closer, obviously it's not the real Australian government email address that would be the case for a real legitimate message. If you try to reply to the message, often you'll find that the reply to address is different from the address that claims to be sending the message. Often it's a Gmail address or a Yahoo address or something similar, which again is another indicator of the fact that it's not a generic, it's not a legitimate message. And then really the key one is most of the links that are there will be obfuscated. And what that means is you won't be able to see what the link is from just looking at the email. It might be a button or it might be some text that's been set as a hyperlink, but if you put the mouse cursor over the link, generally it will actually pop up without clicking on it. It'll pop up and give you an indication of what the real link is. And if when looking at that it doesn't look like it's a legitimate link that should be there for that message, then really the best recommendation is just not to click on it. So it's a useful resource that you can use to get some indication of whether or not a message is legitimate.
So if the email you're concerned about contains any of the indicators that Nick's spoken about on the previous slide, it's important to treat it with the utmost of caution. If you're not sure whether it's a phishing scam or not, one of the things that we would strongly advocate is that you verify this with the purported sender of the email, but using contact details that are not obtained from the email itself. Because if that email is a phishing scam, then it's likely those contact details are bogus. So one of the things we would recommend is that you use contact details you either already have on file or you obtain from a reputable source, such as the organization's public website, and you use that to verify the legitimacy of the email message to confirm whether it's a phishing scam or not. You'll also recall that in Webinar 1, we spoke about, in the context of starting out your cybersecurity journey, the utility of using an email filtering service, and particularly using a cloud-based email service such as Google Mail, Amazon Workmail, Office 365, which include inbuilt filtering. The advantage of these types of services is they include inbuilt filtering, which can help filter many types of phishing scams out from your incoming email traffic stream, so that those sorts of emails don't actually arrive in your inbox, or a significant proportion of those emails don't arrive in your inbox. And that significantly reduces the burden on your staff to be able to identify every single type of phishing scam that might arrive. And given the number of emails that are now being sent of this nature by cyber attackers on a daily basis, that's an important step. Now, the other important point to appreciate when it comes to phishing scams is that, and Nick already spoke about this in some detail earlier on, is that while much of the advice you'll see out there principally focuses on the steps you can take to address or strengthen your security in the context of phishing scams in relation to email, these types of scams can actually be disseminated via multiple communication channels. So also social media such as Facebook and LinkedIn, but also SMS. So as an example, in early 2016, the Australian Communications and Media Authority issued a public statement warning that a widespread phishing scam was taking place that targeted customers of major financial institutions across Australia and New Zealand. And the phishing scam was actually disseminated via text message. So customers of these financial institutions received text messages which prompted them to log into or click on a link or select a link from the text message that forwarded them to bogus websites that appeared to closely mirror the websites of the banking institutions involved. And they're effectively asked to provide their login details, which cyber attackers then sought to appropriate for their own use, for example, to undertake fraudulent transactions against against the relevant customer's consent. So it's important to emphasize to your staff within your organization to exercise vigilance across all possible communication channels that might be subject to a phishing scam. And that isn't just email, it also includes avenues such as text and also social media. Now that brings us to the second type of malicious email scam that we'd like to discuss today, and they're known as business email compromise scams, or alternatively CEO fraud scams. Now, the premise behind these types of attacks is relatively simple. Cyber attackers will look to masquerade as someone within your organization in a position of trust or authority, such as a CEO or a senior manager, or alternatively someone you're in an ongoing relationship with external to the organization, such as an external supplier or contractor. And they'll look to target via sending an email message to someone within your organization who's in a position to control or undertake transactions using the financial accounts of your organization, such as a financial secretary or an account manager or so forth. And they'll typically request via these email messages an urgent transfer of funds to a third-party account for an illegitimate, bogus purpose, such as an unexpected expense, an unexpected invoice, or so forth. Now, as I say, while the premise behind these attacks is relatively simple, they have rapidly been growing in frequency in the last 2 years in particular. And the main reason for that is that cyber attackers, because of the significant payoffs that can be involved in business email compromise scams, spend significant amounts of time researching these scams to identify staff within your organization who might be in a position to be most susceptible to falling prey to these threats. In fact, the US Federal Bureau of Investigation's Internet Crimes Complaint Center actually ran a survey, the results of which were released in mid-2017, looking at the growth of business email compromise scams in the last couple of years. Now, interestingly, that survey found that for a scam that's only been relatively recent in its emergence, there's been over 24,000 reported cases around the globe of business email compromise scams. And that, while that is a significant figure for what's a relatively new type of scam, the interesting point is that, as we mentioned in our first webinar as well, it's likely that's really only the tip of the iceberg, because many cyber attacks of this nature simply go unreported by organizations. The survey also found that around 5.3 billion US dollars had attempted to be stolen by cyber attackers through these types of scams over the last couple of years. And it was also found that around 2.3 billion US dollars has, in estimation, actually been stolen as a result of successful business email compromise scams over the last couple of years. So, as I say, the payoff for cyber attackers can be quite significant. It's one of the reasons we're seeing these types of scams grow in prominence. Now, in terms of the potential indicators of a business email compromise scam, they're not entirely dissimilar from what Nick spoke about in relation to phishing scams, but there are some things to be mindful of. In particular, if you receive an email that contains an unexpected request for an urgent transfer of funds to a third-party account, that's a red flag for a potential business email compromise scam. So it's important to verify the legitimacy of the instructions in that email by, for example, relying on out-of-band contact channels such as phone or in person to verify the instructions in the email before you act on any instructions. So be very, very cautious when it comes to those sorts of types of emails. In addition, if you receive an email and you click the reply button and you notice the reply to address is different from the address of the purported sender, for example, it goes to an unfamiliar third-party Gmail account, that could be an indicator of a potential business email compromise scam. And lastly, if you receive an email that you're unsure of the legitimacy of, and you notice that it purports to come from a party you've dealt with before, but the language and expression in it is not consistent with what you're normally used to receiving from that party, that could be an indicator of a potential scam email and is something to be mindful of.
And just on this as well, one of the things that we've seen, I've seen personally in the last few months, obviously in terms of running Hyvant, we do any number of payments out to third parties, and each time we've made a new payment to a third party, we've actually received a phone call from our bank that specifically has asked us whether or not we've confirmed the bank details by phone with that party before we put the payment through online. So this really is something that's starting to be quite widespread in the market. The one on the screen here, this is actually one that happened to one of our clients as well. And interestingly, this is one of our clients was a financial services company, but this wasn't related to that. This was actually related to the CEO of that company in his personal time. His personal time, he was the treasurer of a sporting club, and on the sporting club's website they had the president, they had the treasurer, they had the secretary, they had their email addresses, phone numbers, and it wasn't a large sporting club by any means, but an email was sent purporting to come from the president. And it was sent to the secretary and effectively had the message that you see on the screen here. It simply says, how are you? I would like to know if you can initiate an international wire transfer today. Please let me know so I can send you the bank details. Which, on the face of it, when you're looking at it, knowing that it's a scam seems reasonably unusual, but it wasn't particularly out of context. So the initial response was sent back and said, yeah, look, I can go to the bank if needed. And then the next message that came back from the malicious user effectively said, great, here's the bank account details. I can't remember, it was in a European country, might have been Switzerland, and please transfer the amount. It was about $18,000 or $19,000. Now, it was at that point that the treasurer phoned the president, largely just to confirm what it was for. There wasn't really a huge objection to the payment. There wasn't really a huge problem. It was more just out of interest to get an idea of what this payment was for. And the president, of course, said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never sent you that email. And so these emails do happen, and they often target things like sporting clubs, any organisation where you can get that sort of clear understanding of who's likely to be making a payment, the treasurer obviously being a good indication of that. So these email scams really do target small to medium organisations, and they can be devastating, as you can imagine. If you actually complete that transaction and send $20, $30, $50, $100,000 away, the chances are most of the time it's not going to be able to be recovered. So in terms of how to be secure, there are a few key things you can do. One is making sure that you're aware of the information that's made available online. Now obviously with Facebook and LinkedIn and any other number of social media platforms, a lot of information is now shared about organisations. It's not hard to find out who is the finance manager in an organisation. It's not hard to find out who they're connected to and who they're talking to. And that increases the need for everyone to be very, very cognizant of the fact that messages can be constructed with that information, that messages can actually represent that they have a relationship when in fact that's not the case. But really for me the most important thing here is any message that gets sent that is requesting a funds transfer or requesting, for example, the change of a bank account, a target bank account detail, really needs to be verified by phone. If it can't be verified by phone, some other out-of-band means. So what do we mean by out-of-band? Something other than replying to that email. So whether that's through an instant messaging platform, whether it's through WhatsApp, whether it's through phone, just something that separates it from the channel that the attack itself potentially is coming through. Obviously ensuring that email accounts are protected by strong authentication will reduce the likelihood that the attack is actually coming from the real email account. And certainly making sure that all staff have training in how to spot some of these emails, and also are actually given the power to actually make decisions about withholding payments if they really feel that there is a potential fraud going on. Now, the next one we'd like to talk about is ransomware, and ransomware ties in quite closely to phishing emails because historically most of the ransomware attacks that have happened in the last few years have had email as an initial attack vector. It's been a case of a user clicking on a link or opening a file, and that has then executed an exploit that has compromised the system and encrypted the files. Now, as we've mentioned in webinar 1, ransomware effectively involves all of your files being encrypted so that you can no longer access them unless you pay a ransom. Now, in practical terms, what that looks like is the screen at the bottom here. Now, this is from WannaCry, which was the recent attack a few months ago, which infected some 230,000 systems in about 150 countries. Now, this is not unusual, or it's not unheard of. Certainly the scale of it was unusual, but things like CryptoLocker and any number of other ransomware attacks have really been a scourge of the internet for many, many years now. Now, generally speaking, the amount that the ransoms ask for are designed to be relatively appealing. In the WannaCry example, as you can see on the screen, it was looking for a payment in Bitcoin of what worked out to about $300. So it's designed to be set at a level to encourage you to pay it. But the reality is that more and more paying the ransom won't get you back the files. There are certainly cases where it will, but generally speaking, it's certainly not recommended. And the reality is that ransomware is something that isn't going to go away because it is a very, very effective way for attackers to turn a compromise into an easy financial gain, which goes back again to the fact that the vast majority of these attacks are put in place with the primary intent being of getting a financial gain for the attackers.
So, because ransomware is one of the most insidious and rapidly growing forms of malicious software circulation that we're seeing, and particularly have seen in the last 1 to 2 years, it's important to be aware, be cognizant of what steps you can take in order to help minimize your organization's susceptibility, first of all, to falling prey to a ransomware attack. But if you do fall prey, there are also steps you can take to help mitigate the potential effects, the devastating effects that can flow from a ransomware attack. And so you're not really cornered into a situation where you have to consider paying the ransom demanded by cyber attackers. So I want to go through a few of those on this slide. And firstly, making sure that you have a good, robust patching process in place for your important operating systems, your key applications and so forth is absolutely critical. The WannaCry ransomware attack is really a case in point. As Nick has already mentioned, that ransomware attack circulated quite prolifically in a short period of time because it took advantage of a vulnerability in the Windows operating system. Now, that vulnerability enabled the ransomware to spread quite prolifically across networks. The interesting point about that is that Microsoft had released a patch for that patched that particular vulnerability 2 months prior to the release of the WannaCry ransomware. But many thousands of machines around the world simply had not applied that patch. And if they had, it would have drastically reduced the ability of that ransomware to spread. So it really goes to highlight the importance of making sure you have a good patching process in place. Now, the other key point that's really critical when it comes to ransomware is making sure that you back up your key data within your organization. And that really involves making sure that your organization is well aware of what your key information is. What's the key information that you rely on a day-to-day basis to do business? And where does that reside? What systems does that reside on within your organization, or alternatively even external to your organization? Where is that information? And then looking at what strategies you can put in place to make sure that information is backed up on a regular basis, ideally daily, but at minimum weekly, so that if you do experience a ransomware infection, you have access to a recent store of that data and you're not forced into a situation where you necessarily have to pay the ransom to get that data back. In terms of the different types of backup solutions that are available, you can either use a cloud-based backup service, and there are a number of these. In our cheat sheet, which we've made available on our Security Colony website for Webinar 2, we've provided access to a link which provides an overview of different types of cloud-based backup solutions. The advantages of these types of solutions is they can make relatively easy the whole backup process, and they can automate that backup process. But the important thing is that you undertake some form of backup, and so the alternative might be, depending on what suits your business, even backing up data off to an external hard drive on a regular basis and then checking those backups regularly. So for example, on a monthly basis, going through those backups and looking at some key files to make sure those backups are actually, the data is actually accessible and usable, to confirm those backups will in fact be reliable should you experience a ransomware attack, is a very, very prudent step and something we'd strongly recommend. Now, we've already spoken about the importance of using, or the handiness of using a cloud-based email service in the context of something like a phishing scam. That very much also applies in the case of ransomware, because cloud-based email services such as Office 365, Amazon Workmail, Google Mail include inbuilt filtering that can filter out many types of malicious emails that contain malicious attachments that could include ransomware prior to those emails even reaching your organization's inboxes. So a very, very worthwhile step. The use of security software, and this includes reputable solutions such as Norton Security, McAfee, Carbon Black and Cylance, is also very valuable. Security software can help to detect many types of ransomware prior to those malicious files potentially infecting your machine and encrypting your data. To be clear, it's not a 100% foolproof strategy in the sense that there are so many strains of ransomware nowadays being released on a regular basis that the security software won't necessarily keep up with all types of ransomware that are in existence, but it will be useful in detecting many types of ransomware, and so is a very useful strategy as part of a broader defense strategy, I guess you can say, in relation to ransomware. We've already again spoken about the importance of training your staff in the signs of potentially malicious emails. In the context of ransomware, that includes identifying emails that contain unexpected attachments and making sure they don't execute those attachments if they're not confident of the legitimacy of the email involved. Now, cyber insurance is something we also spoke about in Webinar 1, and it's not really a preventative strategy when it comes to ransomware, but it is something that's very, very useful in terms of mitigating the potential losses, financial losses that might flow from a ransomware attack if you do end up being infected. And so it's worth looking at cyber insurance, particularly if you're further along on your cybersecurity journey. Now, it's important to look at the nature of the policy involved and obviously the wording of the policy to make sure it covers these types of attacks, but it is something that we're seeing more and more organizations consider. Finally, it's worth mentioning a website called the nomoreransom.org website. Now this is effectively a collaboration of a range of industry bodies and industry associations and law enforcement authorities around the globe that have come together to develop this website, which is provides a range of educational resources when it comes to ransomware, and also provides access to a range of decryption tools for common types of ransomware. So if you do end up being infected by or suffering an infection from some form of ransomware, it's worth checking out that website because it might provide you with access to tools you can use to obtain access to the data that's been encrypted. But again, it's not a guarantee because there are so many types of ransomware being released now on a regular basis that then there are not necessarily decryption tools available for all types of ransomware. Now that brings us to the third category of, I guess, cyber attack that we'd like to discuss today. And effectively, it's a broad label that we've termed hacking and device compromise. To be clear, this isn't a single type of cyber attack. It refers to a range of different techniques that cyber attackers might use to gain unauthorized access and compromise the security of your internal IT infrastructure, or alternatively your external internet-connected infrastructure, such as your public-facing website, your email service, your online databases, and so forth. Now, the key point to appreciate is that regardless of what in particular cyber attackers are looking to compromise, whether it's your internal infrastructure or your internet-facing infrastructure, they're typically looking to do so covertly. So in other words, undetected, so that you don't actually appreciate that you've been subjected to some form of cybersecurity breach. And their objectives can vary in nature. It could be to extract information to expose your organization, or it could be to gain notoriety and so forth. And we'll discuss that in subsequent slides. But the important point to appreciate is that with these types of attacks, they may be, the end game for cyber attackers may either be short-term in terms of quickly breaching your security and, for example, releasing information that is sensitive to your organization very, very quickly into the public domain to cause your organization damage. Or alternatively, it may be a longer-term game in which cyber attackers may not necessarily make it apparent that you've been subjected to some form of cybersecurity breach. It may be what is commonly known as an advanced persistent threat scenario, in which cyber attackers are really undertaking a long-term reconnaissance of your organization's activities for any number of purposes, perhaps to commit a more significant cybersecurity breach months or even years down the track. So that's also important to appreciate. Now, in terms of the various types of attack methods that cyber attackers might use, we've already really discussed this in other contexts in terms of the other threats we've referred to today, but I'll briefly talk about them again in this slide here. Now, firstly, cyber attackers may look to compromise the security of your external-facing infrastructure, your internet-connected systems, or alternatively your internal IT infrastructure based on insecurities in the way that infrastructure is configured. So for example, if you've made an application service available publicly online that shouldn't be made available publicly online, or it hasn't been secured appropriately such that it's relatively easy for knowledgeable cyber attackers to gain access to, then that can be used as a foothold or leveraged by cyber attackers to gain a foothold into your internal IT infrastructure. Alternatively, cyber attackers may look to compromise your public-facing website if there are insecurities in the way you've configured that website, for example, to manipulate the back-end databases that support that website even though they're not meant to be able to do so. Alternatively, cyber attackers may look to compromise your IT systems through unpatched software and take advantage of vulnerabilities in software that you have on your systems, which is why we've consistently spoken about the importance of making sure you have a good, robust patching process in place and you ideally enable auto updates. And finally, they may take advantage of human error within your organization. So the principal vector via which this may occur is the circulation of malicious emails or sending malicious emails to staff within your organization. And these emails might contain malicious attachments, and if that attachment is clicked on by staff who are unaware of the potential indicator of a malicious email, then that could compromise devices within your organization with malware, and that malware can then provide cyber attackers with a foothold into your organization. Now, in terms of the steps to help mitigate the threat of hacking and device compromise, again, you'll notice there's significant overlap with what we've spoken about before. We've already spoken about the importance of having a robust patching process in place to prevent cyber attackers taking advantage of vulnerabilities as a way to gain a foothold into your IT infrastructure and ultimately into your organization. And one of the best ways to do this is to enable auto updates across key devices such as smartphones, tablets, desktops and laptops and so forth. We also have mentioned security software in the context of ransomware, but it's worth mentioning again in this context as well. Security software is particularly helpful because cyber attackers are now using another vector to distribute malware, not in addition to emails. And they're using compromised websites. So effectively what they're doing is they're taking advantage of websites that contain insecurities in the way they're configured and then manipulating those websites to create what's called a drive-by download scenario, in which end users then visit those websites and have malware potentially installed on their machines. Now, the advantage of security software is that reputable security software solutions have blacklists which are continuously updated, which identify many of these types of malicious websites. So if someone within your organization attempts to visit one of those websites, the security software can intervene and prevent that website from actually being loaded prior to the potential installation or loading of malware onto one of your organization's devices. Now, as we've already spoken about and previously, the importance of your staff being aware of the potential indicators of malicious emails, and as I mentioned, particularly being cautious when it comes to treating malicious attachments or making sure not to execute malicious attachments that are sent by cyber attackers via these types of emails. Online security services are not something we've referred to previously, but they're worth mentioning in the context of hacking and device compromise. Now, these are effectively solutions available online at a nominal charge. They're provided by organizations such as Akamai and Cloudflare, and there are others, and we've included references to these in our cheat sheet for Webinar 2 available on the Security Colony. Now, these types of services effectively, and they're also known as web application firewalls, they sit transparently in front of your website. And if cyber attackers attempt to exploit any underlying vulnerabilities in the way your website has been configured, that web application firewall can effectively act as an extra layer of protection to try and prevent cyber attackers being able to successfully exploit those vulnerabilities to compromise your external facing or your internet connected infrastructure. So they are worth considering. And finally, considering engaging a third party to undertake regular security testing of your external and your internal facing IT infrastructure is a very prudent step. It's something we'd recommend most organizations, or really all organizations, look to do on an annual basis. Now, with full disclosure that Hyvant is one organization that offers these types of services, but there are many organizations out there that do offer reputable penetration testing services, web application testing services, and it's important you engage someone if at all possible, because that can help to proactively identify any security holes that might exist either in your external facing infrastructure or your internal infrastructure, so that you can take steps to remedy those holes prior to the cyber attackers possibly using that as a foothold to gain entry into your organization's infrastructure.
Now we've just got a few more slides to run through. Just a reminder, please do submit any questions that you have. There's a question bubble, I think, at the bottom right of the screen. And we should hopefully have a little bit of time at the end of this to run through those questions then. Now, the next section we're talking about is insider threats. Now, insider threats break broadly into two different groups. The first being malicious attackers, and I guess at an international scale, we've seen the cases of Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning, who have essentially taken sort of intelligence level records and have leaked those. The same thing can happen at a smaller scale, both to big business and also to medium business and small business as well. So malicious insiders, particularly sort of previous staff members, can cause some problems. Now, realistically, if an insider that has legitimate access wants to cause damage, there's not a huge amount that can be done to stop that. Really, the most important things you can do are make sure that you go through an effective onboarding and recruitment process, including background checks, and to ensure that you actually disable accounts as soon as someone leaves the organization, so that you know at least who has access to sensitive material inside the organization. But probably a much, much broader school of insider threat is actually human error. It's not malicious. It's simply either an error or through a lack of there being a better business process. And that's something that we see a lot, which is people trying to do the right thing, but simply not having a secure way to go about their day-to-day role. And a simple example here is with information transfer. If someone needs to send a really sensitive spreadsheet from one organization to another, then that could either be done through email, it could be done through putting something on a USB stick and sending it over. There are a lot of ways that it can be done that ultimately aren't very secure. But unless there is a business process that's put in place around using a secure file sharing system to do that exchange, then people are going to find the path of least resistance. So really one of the sort of key tenets that we talk about is making the secure way the easy way. If you can make the secure way the easy way for most of your business processes, generally speaking, a lot of the elements around human error will go away. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got things like cyber espionage. And I mentioned before that the likelihood that a foreign government will go after a small business generally would seem fairly remote, but there are documented cases in the media of, for example, architecture firms that have designed buildings that are being used for sensitive government agencies being compromised to have those plans taken. So scenarios like that do exist. We do have situations where foreign governments target small to medium enterprises because of the organisations they work with. And likewise, hacktivists really can go after any organisation based on their beliefs, based on their political beliefs, and really there's not a lot that changes in terms of how you defend against that, but the attack techniques might change because they're less interested in financial gain and more interested in just causing harm to the organisation. Denial of service attacks, again, are really quite a targeted type of attack that generally don't touch small to medium businesses, but they can, depending on the type of organisation. And with a lot of these things, whether it's insider attacks, whether it's nation-state sponsored attacks, whether it's hacktivists, or even the type of attack known as denial of service, really what's important is understanding your business threat profile. So who's likely to go after the organisation? What data do you have? Do you have an online transactional system? Do you have a reasonably visible sort of presence in the market? Is there a reason why people would want to try and compromise the organisation? Now, denial of service attack is often done just to cause brand damage. It's just to knock a system offline, either for a political statement or to try and impact on your ability to generate revenue. So it's specifically targeted often at transactional systems, things like gaming systems or other large e-commerce based systems. In terms of responding to it, the response is generally much the same as the other controls we've talked about. Online security services like Cloudflare and Encapsula can certainly help to clean that traffic, and depending on the scale of the organisation, there are other solutions as well. And the other thing you can do is really talking to your ISP. The reality is to try and respond to a denial of service attack, you need to get as close to the traffic as you can. And so that means talking to your internet service provider, telecommunication service provider, and finding out how they can help you. And if you do suffer from an attack and you put in a call to them, what's their response going to be and how are they going to be able to support you? So in conclusion, we've run through some of the threats today and talked about emails, we've talked about ransomware, hacking and device compromise, denial of service, and some of the other attack types around insiders and even nation states. A lot of that can seem daunting, but really the key message of this whole webinar series is that while the threat landscape, while cybersecurity and cybercrime may be a really, really large area, the reality is that the responses that we encourage you to take aren't necessarily that complex. And having an awareness of what you can do to actually improve so that you're a little bit more secure tomorrow than you are today is really one of the most important things that we hope that you can take away from these webinars. In terms of the resources that are available, so the ACCC Black Book of Scams is one that's really worth looking at. It's not specifically targeted at online scams, but the reality is that a lot of what we're seeing online is not that different from what we see in the offline world. There are a lot of the same scams just transferred to an online environment. Stay Smart Online we mentioned in the previous webinar series, and certainly we recommend that you have a look at those booklets. And Security Colony likewise, we really recommend that you have a look, log in, it's a free service, log in, download some of the resources and ask us any questions that you haven't been able to ask here today. So to wrap up, that was the second webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. There are 3 more webinars in this series. And from here on, we really start focusing on practical steps you can take to help secure the organisation. The third webinar is focused specifically on cybersecurity operational controls. So moving past the threats that exist, what can you do? What can you specifically implement? What processes and technologies can you use to improve the security of your small to medium business? After that, we'll focus on incident response and incident response processes, which is a really, really topical area and very important. Because the reality is, as good as your controls will be, you will have an incident at some point if you spend enough time doing business online. And the last section will be looking at cloud-based services and other third-party service providers and how you can ensure the security of a full supply chain type environment. So again, thanks a lot for joining us, and we certainly look forward to answering any questions that might have come through, and we hope to see you on Security Colony as well.
Excuse me. Thanks, Nick and Aaron. That was terrific. In fact, it was so comprehensive and detailed that you've not been able to elicit one question, so I presume you've covered all the subjects that people were interested in. I might just see if you've got anything that you feel you missed or just wanted to highlight at the end, or do you feel you've pretty well covered the turf?
Well, look, I think we've pretty much covered it. I think the only thing that I'd really highlight is that it's such a broad area. You know, cybersecurity is often talked about as being an inch deep and a mile wide, and it covers everything from, you know, physical security of data centers through to encryption, through to access control. We have all these different, you know, things around two-factor authentication and multi-factor and biometrics, and there's a lot of complexity, and it's really, really easy to get lost in that complexity. But when you take a step back and look at, you know, what are the specific things that, if you had them in place, a lot of these threats wouldn't hurt you. And really you come back to things like patching. Patching is probably the most boring and in many ways the most onerous of the cybersecurity controls that exist. But almost all of the ransomware scams that are out there rely on a patch being missed, so a vulnerability being there, so a system being able to be compromised. You know, most of the hacking and device compromise that exists is based on weaknesses in systems that, again, have been patched. Certainly there are what are known as zero-day vulnerabilities, so vulnerabilities for which patches don't exist, but that is really, really the very, very outer edge of the attacks that we're seeing. The vast majority are things that have been patched. So having a really robust patch process, using some software like Secunia PSI or other vulnerability scanners that can identify missing patches and then help you to install them is really, really worthwhile. And if you can ensure that systems are well patched and also having strong passwords and the other controls we've talked about, if you can do those things that are reasonably simple, it doesn't mean that they're easy and it doesn't mean that they're not time consuming, but they are reasonably simple. That will really help you to ensure that you have a much, much lower likelihood of having a security problem.
And just to add to that, we spoke in the first webinar about really cybersecurity or cyber attacks potentially being ultimately at some level inevitable. And this isn't about necessarily achieving perfect security. It's about doing what we call minimum viable security. So doing, I guess, the key things that help prevent the vast bulk of attacks. So ultimately what we're aiming for is a situation where if you are subject to a cybersecurity breach, it's ultimately because it's a unique type of attack or cyber attackers have had to work particularly hard. With something like the WannaCry ransomware attack, it was a relatively simple vector or avenue that allowed cyber attackers to so prolifically circulate that ransomware simply because something as basic as a patch that had been released 2 months earlier hadn't been applied. So that's really what these webinars are geared towards. Yeah.
We've received a couple of questions now, Nick and Aaron, so I might just throw them across the room to you and
Sure.
you guys can grab them as they flow past. We've got a question about which says, if I turn on auto updates, how much risk does that mitigate?
Yeah, so turning on auto updates across everything that you can will certainly mitigate a lot of the risk. So obviously the main platforms being, you know, Windows or OS X, Android, iOS. Turning on auto updates across all of those is really, really a good place to start. Even with auto updates often will still pop up with that message saying, do you want to install the patches now or do you want to delay for a few hours? And obviously delaying for a few hours is not going to be the end of the world. If you keep clicking the delay for a few hours button for a week and a half, that's starts to be potentially problematic. But the other thing to remember is not all software has that setting. So when we're talking about installing patches, it really has to be everything from your external zip handler like WinZip through to all the various Flash plugins and other bits and pieces that exist on your system. And a lot of them may not have auto update. But certainly for the big ticket things, sort of all the main operating systems, all the Adobe products, Java, browsers, if they all have auto update, and often that requires, for example, closing the browser and reopening it in order to complete the update cycle, if you do those things, that certainly mitigates the vast majority of the risk.
Thanks, Nick. The next question relates to Facebook scams, and I might just read it as it comes in on my iPad here, because it'll probably mean more to you than to me. Is or does Facebook control or filter for malicious business activity? That is, the free iPhone links or even business running purely through Facebook that don't appear to have a traditional HTTP page presence.
So my knowledge of exactly how Facebook does the filtering is limited, but my expectation would be that they're going to suffer from the same challenge that everyone else is, which is in order to allow pretty much anyone to set up a legitimate business at pretty much any domain selling pretty much anything, which is kind of the business model of the internet, it's actually really, really hard to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate businesses. Now, certainly I expect that Facebook, similar to Google and other large internet companies, will at least go through some process of checking to see whether or not a domain or a site is actively malicious, but that's never going to be an instant process. So for example, with Google, often when you do a Google search, you'll get links, and there may be tagged saying, this link is known to serve malware or believed to serve malware, or you try to follow a link and it will pop up with a similar warning to that. I'm not sure if the same thing happens with Facebook, but the reality is it's very, very hard for those organizations to try and do that across the whole space of the internet. So to a large extent, the protection for those sites really has to be done at your browser. You have to assume that there will be sites that will slip through the cracks, that if you are visiting those sites, you are going to occasionally come across one that's malicious. And so having a fully patched, fully updated system and everything else is really the best thing you can do to respond to that.
Yeah, and usually these organisations, if they are able to filter out these types of scams before they arrive on your systems, usually, as Nick sort of intimated already, there'll be a lag time. So really the key concept here is to be vigilant immediately, because you may be receiving these messages prior to an organisation like Facebook really becoming aware of the fact that those scams are being circulated using their social media platforms. Okay,
Given the time, I think we'll go to one final question. Before we jump to that, we have been asked about the slides. They will be available as part of the video, which will be uploaded online, and you may, if you're really lucky, get a reminder about that as where it is, or try fishing through not fishing, try searching legitimately through the business.gov.au website. The final question is a nice one to close with. Hi, our small plumbing business uses Yahoo email address to send and receive information for the business, generally just sending quotes, invoices and payslips. Is this really risky? And should we find an alternative email provider given Yahoo's previous problems?
Look, I certainly wouldn't say that Yahoo's previous problems are sort of a demonstration of a lack of interest in security or a lack of care. The reality is a lot of organisations have had and will have pretty significant security breaches. Certainly Yahoo has, Adobe have, LinkedIn have, and those are just some of the ones that we know about. The real question is, is that service giving you what you need? Now, if the Yahoo email account is working fine, I'm not sure what their email filtering is like, but I would expect they would have a reasonable email filtering system built in, again, because of the scale of the platform. Really what we're looking for, and when we talk about using cloud-based email services, it's about the scale of the platform. The advantage of things like Google Mail and Office 365 and Amazon Workmail over something like Yahoo is that they're built with a commercial market in mind. They're built with the intent of being used at that level, whereas Yahoo is probably more of a end user consumer type brand. So it's possible that you may get a different sort of level of support around some of those things. But if you have the same processes in place, if you have two-factor authentication enabled so that accessing the account requires that extra step, if you're diligent in terms of checking bank accounts and going through the processes around invoices that are coming in to be paid, if you've got the business processes in place, then it's probably fine. So I wouldn't be too worried about sort of who that provider is, provided that you've got the processes in place and also provided that ultimately it's giving you what you need.
Okie doke. Thanks very much, Nick. I think that's probably where we'll have to close up for today. So again, thanks to Nick and Aaron from Hivint. The website they've talked about is securitycolony.com.au.
Just securitycolony.com.
Securitycolony.com. So that's it for webinar 2. We will be back here for webinar 3, Cybersecurity Operational Basics, on the 15th of September. So that's 1 month away, usual time, usual place. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.